Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ruben Keir, and I'm the Curator of Contemporary Asian Art here at Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art. I'm aware that there are probably still a few people trickling in. There are quite a few events on at the moment, so we've got quite a dispersed audience. But we'd like to maybe get underway just in the interests of time, and also in the interest of actually getting a fuller picture, I think, of what's going on in the practices of these artists who are here with us today. We're really quite fortunate actually to be following immediately on from Claire Bishop's lecture, whose subject was changed at the very last minute to discuss archives and the politics of archives, and most specifically the archive as a form of installation within this, what's perhaps in an offhand way known as a certain pedagogical term within contemporary art practice. And that's the idea, really, of the viewer as student, as this particular mode of spectatorship, which has been created through perhaps a number of artistic practices, independent artistic practices, but also the institutionalization of a certain form of presentation, and that is the presentation of the archival form. I don't really want to discuss that distinction so much because we actually have some very specific issues, I think, that pertain particularly to these works. Perhaps later in the discussion we may come to some of the kind of more general questions about archives, but for the moment I'd like to maybe step back a little from that broader framework discussion of the archive to talk individually to each of the artists who are participating in the 20-year archive project. Firstly, a little background to this project and where it sort of sits within the APT7 and within the institutional program, I guess, of QAGOMA in general. This it began as an attempt to take account of the fact that this is more or less the 20th anniversary of the APT, and to provide a chance to reflect not just on the event itself, but the context in which that event has taken place in. So the broader social, economic, historical and cultural context that have contributed to the way that artists have made work and shown work, and the way that audiences have understood work from these two extraordinary regions within the context of the APT as a whole. And we were aware that by constructing a rather kind of a rigid chronology with an institutional voice might be a little problematic. We have nevertheless found it very hard to resist pulling material out of our own archive to show, and that's part of an ongoing process of us actually coming to grips with the vast amount of material that has accumulated over the course of the APT. So there are some really fantastic performance documents, artist talks, etc. to explore. But very importantly, we wanted to outsource the risk, as Rachel put it in her questions before, which I'll admit is a factor that faces a lot of institutions these days, and to invite a number of artists who work with archives or who have worked with archival processes, or whose work has been involved in a form of research that really extends beyond the studio, certain forms of social research. And to ask these artists to perhaps interpret existing archives, or to create a sign of an archive that's non-existent. I will say that early on in Claire's talk, just going through my notes here, but she did raise the point of one of the motivating tensions behind the incorporation of archives into a certain contemporary art practice is the need to present memories which have perhaps been absented from official narratives. And I think that's a particularly strong element of Disarmed, imagining a Pacific archive. So on that note, I'd like to perhaps start this discussion, and very much in the spirit of specificity, to ask Torika Bolitangiti to talk a little bit about her project, and if you're able to talk a little about the Disarm project as a whole, Torika.
Sure, yeah. So the Disarm project, we can see just to the right over here, is really about looking at various ways that myself, Teresia, Teiwa and Matt Hunkin have looked at Pacific archives, archives about Fijian militarisation in particular. So we're all sort of working with different sections of that history and disrupting that in different ways. Teresi is a poet and an academic. Matt is an illustrator. And I work in photo media and video. So we're sort of all looking at archives for different reasons. I myself do a lot of recreation in my work, so I use archives as a starting point for accuracy. So the Disarmed project is really about sort of piecing together those different sections of Fijian militarisation that we're looking at. Teresia particularly is interested in contemporary Fijian soldiers that are posted to the British Army. I'm interested in contemporary archives that are created by Fijian private security military contractors who are being posted in Afghanistan and Iraq. And Matt's work is really interested in sort of piecing together those absent narratives that you mentioned for Fijian soldiers who were posted in the British Army during the Second World War. So there's sort of similarities in our work, and I can see why we were brought together for this project, and how that fitted in with Russell and Maud's vision for this.
It's an interesting project because the idea of the archive, and I think its form in its presentation, tends to have its origins within 19th century historiography, and a certain distinction, I guess, that was made in the study of the science of history between the library and the archive. So the library is the repository for secondary materials, and the archive is the repository for primary materials. And the historian, rather than looking at already written histories, goes back to the original materials and interprets them perhaps against some of the passions that were motivating the production of those documents. Historiography, though, recognised the archive as the texts that were written by those who were in power, and I think that was partly because of the nature of education and literacy in those days, and partly because documents that remain are usually documents that are allowed to remain. The really fascinating thing about Disarmed is that uniquely among these projects is it's the one that really occurs in the absence of an existing archive, which is perhaps motivates the need for the subtitle "Imagining a Pacific Archive." What sort of research did you do in the absence of there being an archive to actually scroll through?
Sure. My own research has sort of taken me to the Imperial War Museum in London, looking at archives in Australia, Fijian Museum archives, photographic, sound, video, and really just sort of using them to sort of complete the picture, really. But then that's a starting point for me to then sort of recreate stories and recreate narratives from that.
And the mode of presentation isn't particularly archival. I mean, you're still working in a very visual way.
Yeah, that's right. I suppose when I'm doing my own solo exhibitions, there is often a lot of text around, so I will actually present original texts that have been important as a part of my research. That's the way I like to present my work. So there is always a recognition of the archive there. In another installation, more recently, I used the real photographs from a social media network that was set up just for Fijian soldiers in British Army and doing security work called Soldier Central, or Sotia Central in Fijian. And I reproduced those actual images in that space against my own recreations as well, yeah.
And is there something about what is it that drives you to work in these kind of visual ways as opposed to the kind of purely archival in terms of presentation? As an artist, it's my interpretation. It's I process the information, think about it, and then it's my interpretation and my representation of that information. Is how I sort of look at it. Yeah. Is there something particular to the project though that's associated with that need to kind of tell the story in that way? Yeah. I mean, I'm using all sorts of different media as a part of my research, and then it's sort of
Yeah, it's really dependent on the work that I'm doing, but it comes out in various forms, whether it's photographic or video or or installation. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is that it's interesting that archives will often flourish in the absence of other institutions. So what forms of knowledge flourish in the absence of an archive? And I think perhaps we haven't made as strong a connection in this exhibition, although it's very early. I haven't really thought about it in that great depth yet. But between this and the forms of knowledge that, for example, we were seeing in some of the Pacific performances and Indigenous performances that have taken place over the last couple of days. So I'm talking about forms of knowledge that are conveyed in ways that are perhaps oral or performative or ceremonial that may not actually kind of necessarily cohere with this kind of Enlightenment idea of what an archive constitutes.
Yeah, I think we're all the three of us are all dealing with those aspects in different ways and drawing in those sort of oral and traditional knowledges into the work that we do. Certainly, I incorporate specific Mazi or Fijian Tapa symbols that have been a part of my life, my growing up, my ancestry, and I include those in the work. So there's always that sort of balance between the contemporary and the traditional in my work.
Thanks for that, Tarika. I might move on to Map Office quickly next, and we might just kind of get a nice a panorama, I guess, of the practices that are taking place within this before maybe complexifying the conversation. MAP have produced fantastic work that's come out of research that's taken place over the course of a 6-month residency, I think, with the Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, specifically studying artist practices, but doing two things that I think are kind of interesting in relation to maybe complicating our idea of the archive. The first is that the work is kind of semi-fictional, and you introduce a nice idea. I guess I made that Enlightenment distinction between the archive and the library, but you were speaking about a distinction between the archive and the atlas. Could you maybe talk to that idea?
Maybe I start on the explaining a few elements of the project. Yeah, it's the result of 6 months residency at the Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong, where basically we were interested and we were kind of entering the archive, not so much for the archive itself as a body of work, but more for identifying territories. Territories where we can establish destinations produced by artists or artistic practices existing within the archive. And we identify 111 destinations. And that was with a starting point, with a kind of premise in form of selection that the territory of Asia, at the contrary of looking at it from a kind of landmass approach, we will look at it from something very liquid and kind of moving. And that's very much a condition of artistic practices in Asia. I mean, among the 111 artists that we selected territories, probably more than 70% are either on exile or moving around or so on. That's kind of very informative about the dimension of Asia that we can see from the production. Then what we did with 111 territories, we start to classify them, establish an order, and try to identify if there is any possible relationship between one and the other, like if there is in the context of islands or in relation to archipelagos. I mean, is there any relationship between different platforms, different destinations? And as you say, I mean, most of the territories defined by artists were either real or imaginary, and what we did is basically to appropriate them, to not reinvent them, but really to reinvest them. And that was the conclusion of the Atlas of Asia Art Archive. But then there was a second moment that maybe we want to talk about.
Right.
No.
Back in the dialogue. Yeah, no, the idea is also that the archive is not some kind of dead or static territory, and also most of the artwork today, once they are gone, they are collected, they are sold, and they somehow disappear. So most of the territories we collected are not necessarily finished territories, and the idea was, in the second step, to develop an event or series of events called Performing Via Capella, in which we invited, first time in Hong Kong, 7 artists to not perform necessarily, but to kind of reinvestigate, reopen the file in which the territory was located and put it in dialogue, in discussion, in screening, performance, but mainly in relationship to other artists. And so it's somehow quite experimental, as everyone at that point followed our own rules of the game and went back to the territory that some artists didn't work for the last 10 years, like Yu King Tang in the Cook Islands, and she gave a couple of phone calls to see what was the ongoing Chinese operation in the islands. So it was a very interesting process in which art was not something only collected object-wise, but something that can be really much alive and put in relation through our own interpretation and also others' interpretation.
It's interesting that you talk about this condition of fluidity, or I guess a movement, an ongoing movement of artists, because I think that condition within Asia is very, very similar to the condition within the Pacific, is it not, Tarika, in terms of migration, artists kind of living outside their countries of their birth or of heritage?
Sure. Yeah. A lot of the, a lot of the contemporary art that's coming out of, or that's most well known, is coming out of the diasporic communities in, in Brisbane, in Sydney, in Melbourne, in Australia, and certainly in Auckland, South Auckland in particular. So there's a lot of rewriting, a lot of redress that goes on in the work of these young artists.
Heman, your work is interesting in that while it departs from an archive, it actually takes the form of something that is much more recognisably an art installation. You worked with the ACAPA archive, the archive of the that's really developed out of the APT, and is really the research arm of the APT. That's the Australian Centre of Asian and Pacific Art, and produced a sound installation. What was the process of making that work?
I think first of all, I made a very clear decision at the very beginning of the project that my work will be situated right next to the archive itself, and that it was very important for me that it was seen with such a close proximity next to the material that I was asked to look at. Two, I've also very early on identified the kind of position I want to take while working on the project, that I want to literally sort of envision a process whereby I would not create anything new from the archive. I do not want to create new knowledge from it, and that everything that I produce would be an appropriation of something that's already found within the archive. Third, in the third point being, I'm also interested in somehow involving as many people as possible who's working within the museum in order to create the work. So what I've done is to invite all the curators and people who are within the institution to photocopy material from the archive for me. It's kind of like a human search engine, really. And then using that material for me to read. So it's a very tedious process on my end, where I have to read everything they've sent me, and then to sort of identify and to extract terms and conditions in which are used to repeatedly imagine notions of Asia, notions of the Pacific, notions of relationships between Asia and the world, notions of historicizing Asia. And I think what was, again, constantly on my mind when I was working on the project was to form such relations between a textural field and an architectural intervention, and ultimately to also return the viewership of my work back to that of a reader. You know, how like when one sort of accesses archives, really the primary role of the audience is that of a reader. So that was what I was interested in sort of returning to.
On that last point, how do you think that coheres with Claire's observation earlier that the archival presentation presupposes the audience member as student, as somebody who's kind of already engaged and has the time and will to negotiate that archive. I wonder with the actual kind of physical negotiations that are taking place in your work, that if it's not purely a reading as such, but actually this kind of human movement that's actually motivated by the work.
I think it's very difficult to sort of pre-assume such sort of relations between my work and the spectator at large, simply because I think a lot of people sort of engage with you know, my work on very different sort of diverse levels. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that it becomes very important for me that I do not seek to think about circulation. I'm much more interested in dissemination, where something happens and that this occurrence would translate immediately to something else which might or might not be sensed or felt, but it happened, you know.
And I guess is the other aspect that I'm fascinated in, and it's something across all of your works, Tarika, with the visual aspect of your work, Map with the I guess the sort of fantastic aspect of the work, and Heman with your kind of literary construct that the information from the archive is actually kind of broken down to sound like a sort of modernist sound poetry. Why that decision in particular? Why did you want to kind of detach these signifiers from their context and just sort of have them fired at the viewer like a Babel or something?
That's a good question. I guess it's a form that I've grown very accustomed to in relationship to how, you know, like a lot of literary forms are being transmitted when it's not being read, but it just becomes a kind of like spoken form when it becomes very concrete on that level.
And this process of transmission to the viewer, I'm just curious to see with Map as well. You're going back to I guess the model of the atlas. I guess is something that you're looking at engaging. And there's a lot of geographical terms of looking at these oceanic ideas rather than continental ideas. Looking at Asia as the sort of archipelago. You know, looking at constructing, I think the term that you've used is relational geography. How does this framework of the kind of geographic allow you to communicate with the viewer in a way that's perhaps that would contrast with sort of simply presenting straightforward biographical material or mapping the specific relationships between the artists?
Maybe Laurent will respond to this, but first I would like to go back to your last question to him or to us. And you use the word poetry, which I think is very significant in both our work. And I guess was the same for him, and maybe more obviously than for us, as he's working usually, that we really didn't want to use any image. And when you access archive, basically you're invaded by image, of course, by textbooks or video recording, and I think was really the first statement that we don't want our atlas to be visual, or if it's visual, it would be from other means, from words put together in the form of poetry, and also all those words in dialogue with another, and that thing that's this kind of very common way of communicating. Basically, this kind of sea of data, of images and texts that we found.
I think that the communication was was a very important issue for us, and we very early on started to work on on the principle of navigational technique, and which is really interesting because it's called the portolan, and the portolan is a navigational technique that allows to record the contour of the coast of a land by kind of triangulation. And that was invented around the Mediterranean Sea, and that's why you see all those lines in that each territory basically is linked to the other and can exist only by its relation. And which is really interesting because it's also something that exists in this part of the world. I mean, the similar technique has been invented in two parts of the world, in the Mediterranean Sea to map the land from the ocean, but also on the Pacific island with another technique of, I don't know the exact name, but sticks and shells establishing maps of islands. And I think that's the way we kind of use to communicate this level of relationship and this kind of poetic approach to each territory in regards to each other.
The islands, I guess, as a metaphor certainly within the Western cultural tradition, but also in English, are usually used to create an idea of isolation. You know, the idea of the kind of Robinson Crusoe on the desert island, or the cliche "no man is an island." But it's quite fascinating to think of them as being relational, so that the island is surrounded by the beach in this kind of littoral territory. The island merges into the ocean, and the ocean connects dispersed islands. To me, it seems like a more productive way of thinking about these kind of various interconnected forms of knowledge, even if they're not interconnected, is that ultimately there may be some kind of a relationship between them. Tarika, I wanted to ask you, in terms of pursuing, I guess, academic research into a particular topic, but also working as an artist, and as somebody dealing with forms of narrative that actually kind of sit outside of that Western tradition. How do you reconcile the framework of academia or of contemporary art with these other forms of knowledge, these more immediately communicative? I'm not sure what the word is. Is it I guess a more kind of immediately communicative? Like, a lot of your research has taken place within the space of social media, which I find quite fascinating.
Yeah, gosh, my research takes me everywhere. So how do I reconcile it? How does it materialise in my work?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do you need to reconcile it, I guess, is probably another way to say that.
Do I need to reconcile it?
Maybe I'm asking myself that question.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
Could you maybe just talk about your process of research, and then I'll kind of reset my cultural parameters?
All right, yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, you know, I'm looking at so many different types of archives, but I think one area that I'm really interested in looking at in more depth is those sort of social media archives that you talked about, and I'm really interested in looking at the ways in which you know, Fijians represent themselves in contrast to, say, colonial archives, colonial photographs and representations through literature, but also photographic and video and sound archives. So that's why I'm sort of always, you know, sort of comparing and contrasting. But in looking at these sort of social networks of soldiers sort of talking to each other, representing themselves, that's an area that I'm really interested in looking at.
Could you describe these social networks? Because it's
Sure.
really quite fascinating. I mean, we're talking about dedicated social networks for Pacific men, so working as military officers, or as...
Yeah, so they could be working for British, American armies in particular, but also predominantly for private security companies. There was one in particular that was set up, it had over 20,000 members, but it had to be shut down because it was hosted by the Fiji Times, so with the latest coup, the content couldn't be moderated, so it had to all be removed. So since then, there's been other sites set up. So I originally sort of became a part of that network as a research sort of process, just to sort of look at colours, textures, the way what people were doing on their time off, you know, what they were eating, you know, the way that they were carrying on traditions such as kava ceremonies, you know, through a keffiyeh instead of muslin, for example, or, you know, having a lovo, which is, you know, a traditional Fijian meal in the middle of the desert, yeah, and that sort of thing, just to get that sense of what these lived experiences are for these men and women that are overseas in such sort of extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite fascinating. Firstly, that there is such a big, I guess you could call it a kind of a biopolitical industry where one of Fiji's largest exports is human labour, and that so much of this labour winds up in these kind of quasi-combat situations.
Yeah, there's a whole range of work that's being done. So there's the sort of, you know, there's what's called the dirty, dull and dangerous work. So there's truck drivers, cleaners, all sorts of work that's being done. And that's sort of, it's the absence of their voices that I've sort of tried to look at in my work. But also, you know, thinking of that absence in terms of, you know, contemporary warfare where people may not be on the front line, you know, where things are being activated from quite remote spaces and territories. Yeah.
So, like with nano drones, for example, or those kind of things that are in use, and you visualise that, I guess, directly within the work by the kind of decontextualisation and blurring of these figures. But that condition of absence, or the kind of absenting, even, I guess, of people from Fiji itself to far-flung parts of the world, and then these kind of virtual communities that are created as social networks is really quite fascinating.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And I'm always kind of aware of being an outsider to that community and that process, and really kind of conscious of people's privacy, you know, and how I represent that in my work, and yeah.
It's quite fascinating too that you mentioned that these old forms of knowledge are customary forms of knowledge, I should say, rather than old, are actually adapting to these kind of new social spheres, the sort of new media. Map, I'd be kind of interested to know, because you've put part of your project online, but to what degree does that space, that virtual space, serve as a community within the communities of artists that you investigated, particularly those who are dispersed or are constantly on the move?
I guess that it's part of the principle that as soon as you enter into an archive, you know that it will be a long process to explore or to develop the project. And the online approach was part of this continuous documentation. As Valerie mentioned, performing the archipelago started, but will carry on, and eventually we will reach the 111 kind of performance which each artist kind of engage. But I mean, that's why we use the online platform. But I would like to come back on this idea of knowledge that you just mentioned, which I think is really interesting, because in our case we operated within Asia. I mean, traditionally speaking, Asia being kind of so-called a Western concept, and this premise of looking at it from a kind of liquid or fragment approach was basically to invert the way we perceive Asia. And I mean, being in this part of the world make a lot of sense, actually. And I think that's important, because basically we were starting with the Asia Art Archive, and then, I mean, looking at an atlas, a series of maps that could represent the knowledge and the action and the production of Asia. But then we ended up to not to map at all Asia, but to map the world, basically. And I mean, that's very, very similar to what Iman mentioned. Basically, you start from something and you discover something else.
This is a kind of a fascinating thing to talk about, actually, because there, as you mentioned, that Asia really is a kind of a Western concept, as a kind of a unified landmass. What are the stakes in naming a location or a region? What are the stakes in defining something called Asia or called the Pacific? Heman, I know that you've been speaking about this certain tensions that are evident, I think, within Australia, within Singapore, which is where you're based, and also in other parts of Asia, certainly in Japan, to actually kind of define Asia and to sort of map it from the position of the host country.
Well, I think just, sort of even to start to talk about the APT in its sort of origins in '93 itself, that it was very much possibly a way of defining Australia as much as defining Asia, and that there were all these sort of different processes that was being carried out with this one gesture of creating such an exhibition. Primarily decisions made based on economic, sort of conditions of that time. Also, the APT was very much, in a way, just because of how contemporary art was being framed at the time as well. It was, partly seen by the participants as a colonial project. And I think what was important for me when I encountered the archive again was to sort of create ambiguity in such value judgments in dealing with the material, in that of course there was a lot of intellectual interventions from the very beginning, talking about Jim Supankat's theory of multimodernity. We're talking about Patrick Flores coming in as a person who is able to claim Asia as his home as much as the West as his home, So there were all these sort of different sort of didactical, sort of diverse possibilities in such productions of such territories. And I thought it would actually be interesting to somehow condense a lot of what I've been reading into a sort of structure that really resembles a list, really. A list of terms that could create or to somehow produce a sort of very ephemeral sort of trigger in how we would consensually think about Asia itself.
Tarika, I'm interested to know how you think about we've talked about, I guess, the conceptualization of Asia, but what about the conceptualization of the Pacific?
Yeah, there's always a lot of talk about how the Pacific is sort of represented in the APT. And there's always that discussion about contemporary and traditional work, and the museum and the archive, and it's a really sort of contested area. And I think it's a really sort of a young discussion, actually. The contemporary Pacific art scene in Australia is small, but it's certainly growing, and really, really strong connections being made between diasporic communities all over the place, all over the world.
I guess a lot of what drives the conditions that you've been exploring in your work, that Disarmed explores as a whole, and that kind of process of militarization, has always been driven by concerns of powers outside of the Pacific, kind of utilizing the Pacific. And I think that we can be aware that the Pacific is as much contested territory, if not more, than any of the other kind of border disputes that are currently happening around China, for example. The rather kind of neo-colonial or post-colonial use of the Pacific now for commerce, for various kind of strategic purposes. How do you, I guess, as a woman of, who's living in Australia but kind of identifies with the Pacific community, feel within that flow of forces that are kind of shaping the region, shaping discourse within the region. What do you feel the role for artists is, I guess, in sort of addressing these conditions?
Yeah, it's interesting. This came up at another conference in Melbourne. But it was posed more in terms of what are you doing to help your cousin brothers and sisters, you know, through your practice. And look, a lot of us travel back all the time and do workshops and are really engaged with the community. With my own work, though, I'm really conscious of getting permission to do certain things, so using the Marzi patterns, learning weaving techniques, talking to elders about the research that I'm doing and making sure that that's appropriate, you know. So I think we're always checking back and that's acknowledged by our family back home, and it's acknowledged, you know, that as an important aspect of the work that we do.
I guess to problematise, I guess the way that I think I phrased that question in terms of identity politics, actually. But I think you're talking more about something else, which I think is identification, which is a kind of an active, subjective process rather than one of a kind of an objectification that's sort of associated with identity politics. When you raised the question of the conversations that you were having for the use of particular techniques, I thought immediately of the point that you made, Heman, of the desire to not produce any knowledge, to actually kind of create a work of pure appropriation, and what kind of dialogue those two positions might sort of sit within.
Well, I guess with regards to my project, that was why it was important to situate my work right next to the archive, even somehow through its architecture suggests that the archive then becomes a part of the work itself via creating that sort of in-between space. And in a way, like I didn't want to create an archive that is based on another archive. I didn't see the point of it. And I wasn't interested in somehow making any kind of statement or any kind of academic sort of work based on the archive itself. So I guess what I've chosen to do was really to somehow create a kind of liminal space in which people could somehow be encouraged to look at the archive itself, because it was just right next to it, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting because the obverse of that is that it turns the library into a part of the gallery as well, in the same sort of process, which is perhaps something that Claire was getting at earlier. I imagine that there are a few people who were either at that lecture or not at that lecture here in the audience, and I wonder if anybody has any questions for any of the panel, either about their specific projects or about the nature of the archive as a mode of artistic practice and presentation in general.
Hi, hello. I'm based in Hong Kong, and last week I was speaking with someone from Asia Art Archive, and Chantal Wong, and she was talking about how... Hi, this is better? How, yes, they work with specific researchers across Asia whom they trust, and how they collect this primary material, but ultimately you can't help that there's a certain amount of subjectivity, because what you collect in an archive is what particular people pick. Now this subjectivity, is this something that you've thought about when you're doing your work? Does it maybe influence which archives you consult? And maybe if you're creating an own archive, is this something you think about when you're creating your own archive? So 3 levels. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe I can insert. I mean, definitely, and that's, I guess, the reason why we invite artists to work with the archive. And we are not only artists working with them, also we are head of research, academic. But I think it's very important for them, it's very much also working as a laboratory, to open the door to persons that will probably open new doors and new spaces. And And I guess in most of the case, when they invite an academic, they know more or less the direction in which this person will research. When they invite an artist, they have absolutely no idea what will come out of that. And I think that's the beauty of it. And they make sure to trap you in a way you spend as much time there in dialogues and discussions. And then, yeah, it becomes very familiar also in the way you start working and cooking with them. And with our atlas now, they start to redefine their contour of Asia, because we have another perception of Asia than their Asia. So now I think we are opening bigger zones of Asia that will maybe, I mean, now we created a kind of also division between the librarians and the archive itself. But I think all this discussion and conflicts that an artist can bring, always asking the wrong question, for example, is very important in the process of building up something. And I think Chantal at the moment is making a second field note on this issue, how to archive, and all these kind of little mistakes, or what we call the breadcrumbs, as more important somehow than the main topics. So maybe the artist is a breadcrumb.
Yeah, He-Man, you desubjectivized the process of your kind of selection of something that had been collected, let's say, rather haphazardly, perhaps. How does your work approach these questions?
I think, as with a lot of my other pieces, I've always included a high level of risk and of chance, and I'm always interested in how the notion of sort of the contextual limits of something could push before you would have to call it something else. So in a way, it was sort of a strategy that I'm very sort of familiar with in creating such a piece, in which really, like, when you sort of listen to it, it really depends on how familiar you are with the kind of things we talk about when we talk about Asia, in that you really sort of have this sort of sense of the uncanny, really, because you tend to almost immediately sense a kind of repetition in the kind of words that are used when we talk about this subject itself.
And Tarika, there is, I guess, a subjective decision in your work that I'm quite fascinated by, and that's your focus on masculinity and of a male identity within the Pacific.
Sorry, what was that last bit?
Male identity, I guess, within the Pacific, or the Pacific male body.
Yeah, and that sort of that was sort of how I framed the way I looked at the archive, the collection of audio and photographs in the Imperial War Museum. And I was just thinking about that idea of subjectivity, and I sort of, I was approaching that particular archive in a different way that I would approach perhaps other archives. And I think I went in with sort of a lot of preconceptions about the material that I would uncover, and in fact it was quite the opposite, which was really, really great. So it was all really, really fruitful information for me. Yeah.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Is anybody? Is a question back here? My Phil Donahue thing.
My question's for Heman. I hope that's all right.
I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Is that better? I'm wondering if you can actually speak about the spatial form of your installation. It really interests me the way, as a viewer, when you walk in, you're presented with a horizon line, which you're then invited to inhabit, and as opposed to the way we're customarily kind of always tending towards a horizon line and never retaining it. And I'm wondering if that can sort of be understood as a way of talking spatially about how we might apprehend the archive in different ways that aren't necessarily about just accessing information linguistically, but kind of moving beyond that in a more of a philosophical sense or a phenomenological sense.
I think reading something is a very personal experience, and it's first and foremost an experience for me, whether we're reading fiction or we're reading sort of newspapers or texts. And in that sense, it's also an experience of time itself, and how when we are engaged in this activity, that this sense of time changes. And in a way, like, I think with the installation itself, what I was trying to do was to create a vessel in which you could exist in for the longest time possible. And so it had somehow had to be comfortable without looking cheesy. You know, it had like no IKEA stuff in it, of course, which was important for me. At the same time, there's also this consideration that someone could sit on it without having any kind of sense of furniture, that the whole space would become a thing in itself when you're listening to the 20 channels being played out over and over again. So in a way, like, I kind of see the space as a loop of sorts that could just sort of hold that experience.